on today's Story Beat.
And one of the amazing things for me was, especially with Olivier, much more than with Vivian Lee, you see in the letters the growth and maturity and the progression. You know, at the beginning, they'd run away. He goes to LA to do Wuthering Heights. She follows, lands Gone with the Wind. He leaves her to go to the East Coast to do a play. And during this, they're writing ferociously. His letters are dumb. They're embarrassing. They're what we wrote in our 20s. You know, I love you, I worship you, my angel. No human being who's ever existed could possibly touch the mantle. Now you cut forward a few years and he's shooting Henry V, probably his greatest film. And it's a very different kind of man, far more mature, thoughtful. And then as he grows a bit older, you see a different man, still who's now assured and confident, but also increasingly paranoid, perhaps.
This is StoryBeat with Steve Cuden, a podcast for the creative mind. StoryBeat explores how masters of creativity develop and produce brilliant works that people everywhere love and admire. So join us as we discover how talented creators find success in the worlds of imagination and entertainment. Here now is your host, Steve Cuden.
Thanks for joining us on StoryBeat. We're coming to you from the Steel City, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My guest today, Stephen Galloway, joined Chapman University in 2020 as the Twyla Reed Martin Dean of Film and Media Arts at Dodge College. He's best known for his role as executive editor and producer at The Hollywood Reporter, where he served for almost 30 years. Stephen created and produced series such as The Hollywood Masters and Close Up with The Hollywood Reporter. Over the past decade, Stephen has worked to bring in and support diversity in the entertainment industry. Through a partnership between The Hollywood Reporter and Big Brothers, Big Sisters of Greater Los Angeles, he created the award-winning Women in Entertainment Mentorship Program, pairing high school juniors from South Central Los Angeles with top-level women in film and TV. More than 250 teenagers from disadvantaged backgrounds have participated and gone on to college. Stephen spearheaded The Hollywood Reporter's new Empowerment in Entertainment event. Oprah Winfrey and Stephen joined forces to launch a leadership program for young men and women of color called the Young Executives Fellowship. As an author, in 2017, Stephen published the book Leading Lady, Sherry Lansing and the Making of a Hollywood Groundbreaker. In March of 2022, he published to wide critical acclaim Truly Madly, Vivian Lee, Laurence Olivier, and the Romance of the Century. I've read Truly Madly and can highly recommend it to you as a beautifully written, in-depth story of one of the most passionate, intense, and difficult show business relationships ever. So for all those reasons and many more, it's my great honor and privilege to welcome to StoryBeat today the writer and educator, Dean Stephen Galloway. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you so much. This is a real treat and an honor.
Well, it's my pleasure, believe me. All right, so let's go back to your beginnings. Whatever got you interested in show business in the first place?
Well, I started acting when I was very young. And when I started acting in London on the stage and in television, I remember this light bulb going off and thinking, oh my goodness, there's so much more going on behind the scenes with the writers and the directors.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I fell in love with. But it was a magical time in my life, very different, very glamorous world. And I was surrounded by people who talked about things I didn't know. And I just had a passion to find out more. And they all knew Noel Coward, they knew Laurence Olivier. These were just towering figures, and especially in the life of a very young guy. And somebody who became a mentor of mine, the book is dedicated to him, Peter Rogers, was one of Olivier's closest friends. And he would often tell me stories. My great regret is it's now literally 50 years later, and I wish I'd written them down, because sometimes when I was working on the book, I was scratching my head thinking, what did he say?
Sure. And that's a good lesson, by the way, for anybody doing what you do as in writing books about people, is you want to write things down as fast as you can.
Yes, keep a notepad with you. But back then, I wasn't even thinking of writing.
When did you start to think about it? Obviously, some point. Was it at Cambridge? Was it at AFI? When did you start to think about being a writer?
I think I fell into writing by default. I, as you said, went to Cambridge, studied English. Then I went to the American Film Institute. And then you come out, and I deal with this with our students all the time. You need a job. And in the pre-internet era, it was actually very difficult to find out about jobs.
Mm-hmm.
There were two jobs. The one I really wanted was as a script reader at Universal.
Right.
They didn't hire me. And the one I really didn't want was as an assistant at a newspaper in LA, the Herald Examiner, which is no longer around. And I did get that. And to my surprise, I could write that, and I could write better on a deadline. And this is a critical thing for anybody writing. It's very hard to write, and I sympathize enormously with people writing without a paycheck, without a deadline. A deadline sharpens the mind. It forces you to choose.
For sure.
And so often when I'm writing outside that, I will spend days on one paragraph. You know, you just go back and hone it and hone it and hone it and hone it, and then you never move on. And a deadline forces you to. It forces you to make a choice. And deadline journalism, which I practiced for decades, forces you to think quickly, forces you to make a decision. And strangely, it's often better that way.
Well, I concur. I have 90 teleplay credits, and there's nothing like a deadline.
Yeah, and there's a certain momentum in narrative that comes about when you're forced to keep moving forward and then go back and rewrite. And I remember in my early 20s, Francis Coppola said, someone I knew, when you write a page, turn it over, don't look again. Write the next page, turn it over, don't look again, until you've finished the draft. And by the way, I wish I could say I follow that advice. I don't, but I keep telling myself I should follow that advice. When the whole is in place, you see it much more clearly. And then you look back. Now, what was interesting to me with this book was I spent weeks writing the first chapter. And the first chapter wasn't the one in the book. The book, as you know, begins in the middle of the night with Olivier, a married man with a child, sneaking out his home and going to meet the woman he loves, who's not his wife.
Yes.
It's Vivian. And she's also married with a child, and they run away. And this middle of the night elopement that would change both their lives and have a shattering impact on everyone they knew. And some people will judge them for that. I always try not to judge, but to understand in writing. But it began in a very different place. It began originally with Vivian Lee, not Lee at that point, with her family in India. They were very affluent. Her father had done what many lower middle class Brits did. You know, the height of the British Empire. He left England for opportunity, went to Calcutta, became a stockbroker, did very well. And now he and his very gorgeous wife, said to have been even more beautiful than Vivian, take her back to England. It begins with them leaving the house, going to the ship, this magical journey. They take her to the theatre. She falls in love with London, discovers this extraordinary world. And then one day they put her in a cab, take her out in the country, right to these big gates, and the convent's doors open, and they put her inside, the gates close behind her. They don't see her again for years.
Do you think that that began her psychological journey, which we'll talk about in a bit, but she obviously had troubles throughout her life psychologically. Do you think that was the beginning of it, being left on the doorstep like that?
You know, one of the things the book looks at a great deal is Vivian's illness. She was bipolar. And at a time when they didn't use that word, they called it, manic depression. Not much was known about it. And I've done a lot of exploration. And one of the great things about, being a writer, but especially about being a dean in a university, you can call any scholar, and they'll give you the time. And so I spoke to some of the leading experts in bipolar about what causes this. And some feeling is there's a genetic element, but that there are also environmental factors. There is no definitive answer, but there is a feeling that things can trigger an illness, and that may have been one of them. She was desperately lonely to begin with, finds herself, my God, 6.5 years old in a convent with nuns who know nothing about life outside. And this was not a liberal order. This is pre, the Vatican reforms, when being in a convent was strict, and you flagellated yourself. You weren't allowed to have a bath naked, because the naked flesh was considered an abomination. So she goes from being utterly pampered with nurses and governesses in this very colorful world of India, to being completely uprooted at an age when she couldn't understand. And yes, I think it certainly played a role in her relationships later.
Well, it certainly had to have had an impact on her when you're that age, and that's how you're growing and you're learning at that point everything you know. That's got to be very impactful. So I'm curious, do you think of yourself primarily as a historian, a journalist, just a nonfiction writer? How do you think of yourself, if you think that way at all?
But what a great question. I think I'm an administrator in university, and that takes up most of my time. But in my heart, I'm a writer, and I'm a writer of nonfiction and narrative nonfiction, which is telling a story through facts, you know. The biographical side interests me a lot because I'm very interested in people's psychology and what really makes these extremely complicated people tick. And how do you find that out? And by the way, when you're going into a book like this, which is 4.5, 5 years work, you are living with those people in your mind all that time. And, I just saw the other night, Sherry Lansing. Sherry was for 25 years the most powerful woman in Hollywood, ran 2 studios. And my previous book was the biographer. And I said, Sherry, when I interview you, you're sitting with me for blocks of 3 hours every now and again, but I go home and I live with you. That's what it's like. And you better choose carefully because a lot of biographers end up hating their subjects. When I was thinking of what to write, I was reading a lot of things, and I found out that there's a Marlon Brando archive in Hollywood that's not open to the public.
Right.
And I happened to know one of the trustees, and I went and I looked at all the material, some of which is in this book about Streetcar Named Desire. But I realized after a few weeks, I would get to loathe Brando. The narcissism, the ignorance, the ego. And I thought, I can't live with him in my head for 4 years.
So how do you make a decision that I'm going to live with somebody for 4 or 5 years? Have you gone down that road where you got partway down and had to stop because you couldn't take it anymore?
No further than with Brando. With Olivier and Vivien Leigh, a few years ago, I stumbled on the fact that a British museum had bought her archive, the Victoria and Albert, and that the archive included several hundred letters, love letters from Olivier. And back then I was at the Hollywood Reporter. I thought, this is a great article for us. And I went there and I dug through everything. And then I thought, there's a lot here that should be explored, far greater length than in an article. And then I started reading a lot about them, calling people. And it's a gradual immersion until you realize, okay, now I'm in the deep end and I'm happy swimming around here.
So you are in part making a decision as you're going. You don't make the decision and then say, I'm stuck with it. You're discovering things on the way, and that forms your decision.
You'll start with it when you take a proposal to a publisher.
Sure.
They pay for you to write it. And then there's no turning back. Although the way publishers do deals is structured on the assumption that a lot of writers will never hand in the material. So they give you either 1/3 or 1/4 of your so-called advance money actually in advance, probably knowing that it will barely cover your expenses, especially when you're spending 2 weeks in India or Australia or London. So literally all of that gets used up. But what they know is a lot of these books just don't materialize.
They're very challenging to do.
They're very time consuming, and you better love writing.
Well, your reference notes in the back of the book run 50 pages. Yeah. You've got 50 pages of reference notes. And I'm looking at that going, holy mackerel, that must have been very daunting to gather that material in the first place.
It is, and I fault myself for not organizing it as well as I should. And one of the problems with doing an article is, even if you're, which I did the Hollywood Reporter for decades, the process of writing is different in 2 ways. First of all, narrative in an article is a relatively simple thing. You can keep people interested quite long. But narrative in a book is very complicated. I cut 80, 90 pages at the beginning of the book when the first draft was done.
Wow.
You don't usually do that in an article. An article is never 80 or 90 pages.
Of course not.
That's the first thing. But secondly, when you do a proposal, you have to tell the story and figure out what interests you, but you're only at the beginning, and then all the research begins. And I wish I'd had Excel spreadsheets, things like that, and I didn't. And I was talking to a friend of mine here who's a World War I historian, And I said, I want you to teach me how you organize your material. And I'm weirdly a very organized person, still not organized enough, because you'll find something, you go, where did I get that? And I know I read that, I know I saw, which draft of the book is it in? And there are multiple drafts. And if you're doing a lot of research, organizing it well is extremely important.
Mm-hmm. So do you work from an outline? Or do you need to do a lot of research before you even think about how you're structuring the book?
You do some research, but it's actually, yes, quite a lot, until you really feel you know the subject well. And then you do the proposal, and with the proposal, they want basically a summary of the book, and it's good to write it it's sort of in the way the book will be written. So you're also telling them a story that grabs them. But that also includes who's the audience, what similar books have been done, what would the marketing of this be? You basically have to tell them what their job will be.
Right.
Not how to do their job, but what they've got ahead of them. This book is similar to that book, which did very well. You don't want to include books that didn't do well, And this book is similar to A Portrait of a Marriage by, one of the Nicholsons. Well, I don't think anybody in America is reading Portrait of a Marriage. So you choose books that have had some success. And so you're telling a story like in an article, and then they want a chapter by chapter breakdown. And in my case, I did quite a long summary, again, as if it were an article telling them a story, followed by maybe 3 paragraphs on each chapter. And it's enormously helpful because for most writers, work on a 400-page book is extraordinarily intimidating. And believe me, it's no less for me, even with everything I've written.
Oh, no question. It's got to be very intimidating. And
you start on page 1, I've got 400 pages. And then you get to the end of the first chapter and you realize you've spent far too long on it. And then you want to rewrite it. And oh my goodness, I still got 18 chapters. But if you do break it down like that, you can concentrate on it bit by bit.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I tried to do, having done that preliminary research, was then target what I did. So the Gone with the Wind chapter, which was basically about 3 months work, I'm really looking at Gone with the Wind. And if I find something else along the way that's appropriate for another part of the book, I make a note of it and keep it there. And so a big part of that was working in the archive of the producer, David O. Selznick. There's an extraordinary archive in Austin, Texas, where there are 3,000 boxes of his papers.
Oh my goodness.
It's very well organized. I thought, oh my goodness, too. But you can really call what you want up. Here are the contracts. Here are the script notes. Here is the shooting schedule. And I spent a couple of weeks there going through everything and then wrote it. So my strategy was to cast the net very wide, read to the point where I'm comfortable with what I'm writing, and then break it into bits.
So the book is by and large in chronological order in their lives, though you start when he's sneaking out, as you say.
Yeah.
But by and large, you go back to the beginning and you straight through their lives together. Was that a decision on your part because you knew it would be easier for the reader to consume?
Yes, my goal is to really grab you with the story.
Mm-hmm.
And the narrative is a very interesting thing because I've often thought, why do we like narrative? And why is it important?
Because it's our lives, isn't it?
It's our lives, yeah. And it's a simpler way of understanding them. And it's also a great hook for memory. And if you think of great films or great books and you remember the story and you ponder them and think of their meaning, it helps you consider all the other philosophical or psychological elements. If you write those down on their own without narrative, it's actually harder to think of them later and remember them.
Mm-hmm.
Aristotle said a very interesting thing, speaking about drama. He said that, as you know, the 2 most important elements are plot and character.
Yes.
And of these, plot is the more important. And that shocked me. You'd think character would be. He said plot. It allows us to have a structure to hook other things onto. So then it's, how can I tell this story in a way that's very involving, that lets you understand things as they develop? The problem then, of course, is when you're intercutting 2 people's stories, the drama doesn't always match. The big things don't always happen at the same time.
Right.
And that's when telling a story chronologically becomes difficult.
but you chose to do it that way, and
Yeah.
and it works brilliantly that way, because you're sort of following along and discovering, almost like the readers becomes a voyeur in their lives,
Yeah.
and you are finding out all these things about them that I didn't know until I read your book about their very complicated lives. And he's off having this massive career, and she's having a breakdown basically, and she then goes off and has her bits and pieces of huge career, and it seems like he's a little jealous of it. It's at points. That had to have been clear to you before you started to write. Yes.
Yes. And by the way, going back to your question, there are writers who've chosen other ways of approaching. Sure. Recent book about Hitchcock that looks at 12 aspects of his life. There's a great biography written by Claire Tomalin of a British, very famous person in England, Samuel Pepys, who wrote a diary. If you're an English schoolboy, you know of it. He wrote a diary during the years in which the king was executed, the plague hit London, and the Great Fire swept through London in the late 17th century. And Claire Tomalin's book looks at different aspects of his life. But one of the most interesting things for me depends on chronology, and that is understanding how we all grow and change as people. And one of my hesitations in writing a book about two dead people is, would I be able to understand them? You know, we feel something just intuitively when we meet someone. And I rely on that intuition. Thought, well, I never met them. Am I really going to have a feel of who they are? And what's interesting is you don't have the intuitive side, but when the material is there in the archives and in interviews, you understand on some ways on a deeper level. And one of the amazing things for me was, especially with Olivier, much more than with Vivien Leigh, you see in the letters the growth and maturity and the progression. You know, at the beginning, they'd run away. He goes to L.A. to do Wuthering Heights. She follows, lands Gone with the Wind. He leaves her to go to the East Coast to do a play. And during this, they're writing ferociously. His letters are dumb. They're embarrassing. They're what we wrote in our 20s. You know, I love you, I worship you, my angel. No human being who's ever existed could possibly touch the mantle. Now you cut forward a few years and he's shooting Henry V, probably his greatest film. And it's a very different kind of man, far more mature, thoughtful. And then as he grows a bit older, you see a different man, still who's now assured and confident, but also increasingly paranoid, perhaps. It was amazing to me to be able to dissect the growth like the rings of a tree. I didn't even know that you could. If you look back on your life, or I do, we create an artificial structure. Oh, that's when I was 29, you know, and the truck hit me. That's when the light bulb came off and I knew I had to go and work with Mother Teresa. And in some ways, we're looking back, telling people a fabricated story. When you're reading the diary and the letters, you see it as they felt it at the time, and you can see the stages of growth. And because the stages of growth interest me a lot, that was the reason I felt the book should be chronological.
Well, I think one of the surprises for me, because I didn't really know that much about Olivier's life. I mean, I sort of knew the surfacey things, but nothing in depth the way you portray it. He came from kind of a rough, crude background. He was not in an elite or upper crusty background as a kid. And so he matured, and I'm guessing he matured also through the constant and steady portrayal of Shakespearean characters and working in an industry that sort of forces you to, if you're a star, it forces you to grow up pretty quickly, I would think.
Yes, I think his childhood was very difficult. He lost his mother at the age of 12. His father, who was the sort of country priest, was a very, very demanding zealot who gave up a fairly secure job to go minister to the poor in the slums of London, but was so rejected by them that he lost his job. You know, he's preaching about the Bible when they can barely get enough to eat. And it was in a section of London called the Pigs and the Potteries, where, you know, sewage would be running through the streets. There was a great pool of it that people fall into. It's hard to believe this was London in the early 20th century. It was a very difficult upbringing. One of the things that most interested me was to find out something he didn't know about. And one of the great lessons about writing this book was to realize there are things that shape us in our life enormously that we are not aware of. So when Olivier was 4, his father gets kicked out of this ministry in the shacks and in the slums, has no job. His wife is sort of married down, and they wander through these seaside towns of England looking for work. And it is the hottest summer on record. People are dying from the heat in the streets. And Olivier's mother and sister and older brother are in this sweltering hot room in a horrible boarding house. She's full of resentment about the guy she's married. He's anxious about money, as we've all been at different times, and can't find anything. And the more anxious he gets about money, the more it digs him deeper into his zealotry. All this happened when Larry, as he was called, was 4. He never spoke about it. He never remembered it. The only reason we know it is his sister wrote a biography that was never published of him, and I've seen the manuscript, and she mentions it, and she got the year wrong and said he was 5. And when I was looking research, fact checking, how hot was it then? I realized she'd remembered the wrong summer. And it's an amazing thing, because can you imagine the turmoil and the anguish they all went through? And yet he never remembered it. He was 4.
So they've both been gone. Olivier and Lee have both been gone for quite some time now. Was there anyone you were able to interview who knew them?
Oh, yes. In some ways, this was the toughest part, because it's so long ago. People's memory is distorted. And one of the things I found when I worked on my last book was people's memory is not bad for about 5 years. 10 years, they might still remember with some clarity. After that, fiction and fact get mangled. And you'd be shocked at how people misremember things, cast themselves in a scene that factually you can prove someone else was in, and yet they're insisting, I remember it. So the people I spoke to who knew them were more recent with Olivier, because he died in the 80s. With Vivian, it had been more than 50 years since she died.
Right.
And so I was very lucky. Juliette Mills, Hayley Mills, the actresses, knew her very well. They spoke to me. Patrick Stewart, before Star Trek, went on tour with Vivian to Australia, which was terrific, because I've been desperately searching for somebody who could talk about that. I also spoke to Rosemary Harris, who's a wonderful British actress, and sort of brought things full circle to me, because I'd acted with her when I was 13.
Oh, wow.
And to interview her 50 years later. And she actually called me last week and got on the phone and said, "Oh, Mr. Galloway," which seems strange, because I think of myself as a kid next to her. She's just said she loved the book and how she felt it was very accurate to the man she knew.
Is it possible that when you're interviewing people and their memories are not accurate, as you say, that you then have to really doubt what they're saying? How does that work?
Well, what was that old line during the Reagan era? Trust but verify.
Sure.
You need both.
You need both. So that requires this also this deep research to be sure that what you're getting is accurate. Sure. It also tells you a whole lot about quote unquote eyewitnesses in various court cases and so on.
Oh, but by the way, I was carjacked at gunpoint.
Oh.
Many years ago. And the following day, I couldn't remember accurately what the ethnicity of the people who carjacked me was, how old they were, what they looked like. And it was shocking, because I'm looking in somebody's face 4 feet from me with a gun between us. And you'd think that you would remember it razor sharp. You didn't. So in this, yes, people's memories really get blurred.
How would you say that when you have two people like this with such massive careers, how were they actually dealing with their interpersonal issues at the same time? Because in the book, it's clear that it was a big struggle. And of course, this is in an era before we had the internet. And like you say, it was all through letter writing, and they're separated by great distance for quite some periods of time. How do you think that they were able to even stay together at that point?
This is a great question. I've thought about that a lot. There is something to absence makes the heart grow fonder, that somehow when they're away from each other, they wrote the most loving letters, and then they get back together and fight. There was also, first 10 years, their relationship were pretty wonderful. And then her illness kicked in, and it's just a descent into hell.
But he sticks with her a long time.
Yes. And many people blamed him for leaving her. I don't. To live with somebody, to live with mental illness is just a horrible thing. To live with someone with mental illness is a horrible thing. And I think one explanation is actually that I think his sister had some form of mental illness. And his sister was actually placed in the mental hospital where Vivian Lee later went. And she recommended it to him. I haven't been able to get the documents because the hospital won't release them until, decades after her death, the sister's death.
Right.
But she was placed in this mental hospital. She clearly had some form of extreme mental illness. And I have to assume that growing up to that in some ways normalized it for him. But there is this turning point early in their lives where very young, just before they ran away, literally weeks before they ran away. And as you know, this is how the book begins. They go to Denmark to do Hamlet on stage.
Right.
In the place where it's set. And at some point, something went wrong and she had some kind of breakdown and physically attacked him. And he was in shock. He'd never seen this. He couldn't understand it. And that's one of those lines where in relationships, do I pull back or do I move forward? And he chose to move forward.
Well, yeah, that's one of those things. I agree that when you're reading it, you're going, why did he even stick around with her? So he clearly was deeply in love with her.
Beyond deeply. And what the book was an exploration of was not so much love as passion.
Mm-hmm.
And Olivier's first wife, Jill Esmond, said with astonishing insight and actual empathy, she said to her son at some point, I've only ever seen true passion once. And, heaven forbid that it should ever hit you. She knew. Olivier, in his own memoirs, which actually are terrific, describes it as a virus or like a love potion, just something beyond any capacity you have to resist.
Was there any material that you wish you had gotten that you weren't able to get your hands on?
Yes. There's the material I got, which I couldn't include in the book because it was cut, which is all about the British Raj and Vivian growing up, which is how the book began. Then I cut it because I wanted the book to be the biography of their marriage, not two biographies. And it's fascinating. All these young guys would go off to India or Africa, and there was a drain of husbands. And so women would go out by the boatload to find husbands, and they were called the fishing fleet. They went fishing for husbands. That I had but didn't include. The thing I really wish I could get was Arthur Miller's diary. And as you know, Miller came to England with Marilyn Monroe. They were newly married when Marilyn starred opposite Olivier in The Prince and the Showgirl. Olivier, by this time, was the grandee of British theatre, renowned around the world. She was the biggest star on the planet, and they hated each other. And Arthur Miller kept a diary. And the diary is also at the University of Texas, but it won't be open to scholars until, I think, 2029. And I would have loved to see what he said. He wrote an autobiography where he talks about it, but again, he's looking back from years later. I would have really loved to know what he thought of Olivier and Marilyn and Vivian Lee.
Oh, well, and it would be very interesting to see what his perspective on that was. I mean, we're talking.
The other thing that's interesting is that Olivier's letters to Vivian exist in her archive. Her letters to him can't be found.
Oh, really?
They were around. Hugo Vickers wrote a definitive biography of Vivian about 35 years ago, and he had access to them. They're not around anymore, and I don't know why.
Oh, so you don't know what happened to them then?
No.
Interesting.
And so you find letters from her that are previously published or in other archives. But those crucial letters, I wish I could find.
So, all right, I want to get off of the book for a moment and talk about The Hollywood Reporter, which I think is very important. When you're the executive editor of a major trade magazine or paper like that, what is it that you do every day? You're not just literally editing every article, are you?
I did very little editing. One of the reasons was I became executive editor fairly early on, but then I sort of shifted from job to job within the organization. So at one point, I was running all our magazine publications and events. We do television shows, roundtables, another point, writing a lot of cover stories and profiles. Mm-hmm. But I began in the trenches in the 90s as a reporter and covering all those people that you've all heard about, dealing with them. They weren't easy. Harvey Weinstein, least of all. Scott Rudin, these were the monsters of the business.
Joel Silver, I'm sure.
Oh my gosh, these are really difficult people to deal with.
Sure.
And when I'm
but they needed you, didn't they?
Well, who needs whom more? They need you to some level, but not as much as we needed them to get the big stories. And then when you do have a story that they don't like, I remember being in Cannes I hired a great reporter in New York, and he had an amazing source within Miramax, the Harvey Weinstein's company.
Yes.
And Harvey was going nuts. And we finally had the story about all these executives who'd left the company because he was just bullying them so much. And we were going to write it. And what you do is, you have to give people a chance to comment. And Cannes is a sort of strange place where you get a handful of gigantic hotels built on the beach, and each one is like a watering hole for the industry during the festival. And Harvey had set his anchor down in one of them. And this was, a key place to go. So we go along, this is pre-internet, pre-cell phone, and insist on a meeting. And he walks us into a room, and he was an enormous guy. I'm not. He's chain smoking. He's towering over me and our reporter. And as we go he brings us into this hotel suite, and he starts screaming, I'm going to censor myself, by the way, you mother effing bunch of tabloid hacks. What the FFF? It didn't stop for 50 minutes. I've never seen somebody who can maintain anger. And he's on bending knee, and spittle is coming out. I'm going to mother effing kill you. I'm going to maim you, wound you, torture you, throw you from this window, buy the Hollywood Reports, I can fire you. Part of you saying this has to be an act, but the spit that's flying out doesn't feel like an act. Is he actually going to physically attack me?
I've been in his presence. He is a large man.
Yeah. And in many ways, brilliant. He really invented the independent art house movie that sustained great filmmakers. But when you're a junior-ish reporter and you're dealing with that, it is very unpleasant and scary.
Well, he was intimidating you on purpose. That was his game. My assumption is that was his reputation. He intimidated everyone around him.
He did. By the way, he wasn't alone. There were many people like that in the industry.
Sure.
That's changed. First of all, HR, most studios are now owned by big corporations that think differently, that have shareholders, that have sophisticated HR departments. People can't behave like that. Scott Rudin, all the scandals came out later that we'd heard about throwing phones at people and, screaming abuse. You can't do that in today's Hollywood.
No, it's really changed. And yes, that was the way Hollywood ran for quite some time. I know exactly what you're talking about. It was difficult.
It was kind of a badge of honor of going through that and being able to survive it and deal with it. It's terrible and completely inhuman.
Well, yes. So, all right, briefly, you now are the dean at Chapman College in the Dodge College of Film and Media Arts. Tell us about that program just a little bit.
Oh, I love it. And I'm 63. I came here 2 years ago. To have a career change after you're 60 is the most extraordinary thing.
Mm-hmm.
Because what most people don't realize, especially younger people, is by the time you're doing well and you're paid to do well, you've kind of faced many challenges. And after a while, some things I was doing really started to feel like repetition. We did these very glamorous roundtables with stars and directors. I did them for 20 years. So each year we do some more roundtables, but what's challenging me, what's teaching me something new? And out of the blue, this came about. And I'd become very involved with education 13 or 14 years ago when I created the mentorship program that you talked about.
Right.
Where we took young girls from South L.A. and paired them with top-level women in the industry. And it changed my life much more than it changed theirs. Just to see how, first of all, what brilliance is untapped. There are extraordinary, talented young people who never get an opportunity. And some of these girls went through university, we got them full ride scholarships, and now they're in the industry. They're at Netflix and Warner Brothers. And it was truly life-changing for me to see that. And
I'm sure it's very fulfilling for you.
Yeah. And so I was becoming interested in education, and then I got headhunted and said I'd love to do it. A university is a very different ecosystem from Hollywood.
But there's still politics involved. I've taught for 10 years at a school here in Pittsburgh, and but there's still politics involved.
Yes, I'm glad to say there's less here. The bigger, thank heaven, it's very good from that point of view. The frustration is that universities move very slowly, and you have to get consensus. You can't just mandate things.
How important do you feel it is for a person who wants to be in the entertainment industry, particularly in Hollywood? How important is it for them to get a college degree? Is it critical?
There are exceptions to everything.
Mm-hmm.
But ruling those out, it's essential. I mean, whether we have programs for directors, cinematographers, we have a broadcast journalism program. It's very hard to go into the workplace without really knowing some of this stuff well. The other thing, which is underrated, including by our students, is just the history of film and television. And you can teach yourself a lot of that. Just the AFI has a list of the top 100 movies. Get to know these, because somebody will come to you with a project and you need to know, what, either you got to say, actually, this is a ripoff of something else, or that other film did this really well. Why don't you see how they did it, and either learn to imitate or learn to do it differently, but know of it. And I think it's a bit disheartening to me that a lot of people want to do without educating themselves.
You've already told us some amazing and fun stories.
Oh,
Do you
good.
have a story that you might be able to share with us that's either weird, funny, strange, quirky, offbeat, or just plain funny?
Well, dealing with Harvey was full of those things, and getting all those papers. I think one thing people didn't realize was how vulnerable really successful people are. And, we would do these roundtables every year with the top directors. And one year I did one, I think it was the year of Moonlight and La La Land. And those two brilliant young directors, Dame Chazelle and Barry Jenkins, were sitting at this round table with Denzel Washington and Oliver Stone and Mel Gibson and Mira Nair, great Indian director. And I know they were terrified. And what they didn't realize was that one of the other directors was terrified to come in the room. And as I'm sitting, I'm not going to say which one, but one of them sitting at the round table with our line producer talking in my ear saying, "Steve, we've got a problem. The director won't leave the dressing room. You need to come out." And there are Barry and Damien petrified because they're now in the big leagues for the first time. And are they going to say something dumb, which was like us going to some posh dinner table? And I had to go out and talk the director down, say, you're brilliant. You've done extraordinary work. And then we started the roundtable. One of the worst ones I ever did was with Julian Schnabel, who did an amazing film, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly.
Oh, yes, sure.
And we're sitting at a round table with him, with a few other people, just when we began to do them. One of them was Julie Taymor, who directed Frida, and start leading it. A few minutes in, Julian's huffing and panting and looking very bored. And finally, and he'd shown up, by the way, in pajamas covered with an overcoat. And finally cuts me and said, "These are stupid questions, By the way, this is actually red meat to a journalist. Okay, you want to go down that path? We'll go down that path." So I said, "What do you want to talk about?" He said, "I want to talk about authenticity. I made my film authentically and because I shot it in the original in French." And then Julie Taymor said, "Well, I shot Frida in the English language, but I still think it's authentic." And he shot back at her, "That's why it's such a bad movie," or words to the effect. And the shock and the tears and "what do you do?" were pretty amazing.
And what did you do?
We carried on and diverted it. But I remember saying to myself, if he says anything else, I have to say, we can't carry on like this. You can't be here insulting somebody.
Indeed. It's just not the way it's supposed to work, even though he's an iconoclastic artist.
He is. But usually the ones getting insulted were the journalists like me, where, every great story you have, especially a scoop, especially in the news game, somebody's aggravated about. And they're difficult to write. Just to tell you very briefly, one of the hardest for me was David Milch, great showrunner, NYPD Blue, one of the major writer-producers of television in the past 30 years.
Deadwood.
I remember having dinner with somebody who said, "You do know he's lost 100 million in gambling debts."
Gambling, yeah.
What? Really? And then I had to follow that story. And it was difficult. It's difficult to write. Do you write it? Should you write it? If somebody's got an addiction, whether it's gambling or anything else, but it's $100 million. And I don't know if I could write it. I felt deeply conflicted about whether to write it. And ultimately we found proof that certainly there was certain proof he lost. I can't remember if it was 17, 25 million, but we're talking about gigantic sums of money.
Yeah, crazy.
But it's very hard to write that. And I still don't know if it's right, but I've come to believe your job as a journalist is actually to write the truth, hopefully, if you get it right. If you start censoring yourself too much, you don't write. You become just a publicist. And I didn't want to be that.
Well, Stephen Galloway, this has been a really wonderful treat for me to speak with you today. You are just a really engaging speaker, and the book Truly Madly is fantastic. And I highly urge folks who are interested in Olivier and Lee to check it out and give it a read. And I cannot thank you enough for joining me on StoryBeat today.
It is such a pleasure. We could really talk for hours, and I hope at some point you'll invite me back because I had so much fun.
I would absolutely love to do that. I think we've just scratched the surface, and there's much more to discuss.
Yep, and especially about the writing process.
Indeed.
Hopefully, I've learned a lot the hard way, and I still have a lot to learn the hard way. So thank you very, very much.
And so we've come to the end of today's StoryBeat. If you like this episode, won't you please take a moment to give us a comment, rating, or review on whatever app or platform you're listening to. Your support helps us bring more great StoryBeat episodes to you. StoryBeat is available on all major podcast apps and platforms, including Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Stitcher, TuneIn, and many others. Until next time, I'm Steve Cuden. And may all your stories be unforgettable.